Okay, it looks like everyone is pretty much in, so I am going to get rolling because we've already lost like 17 minutes. We're going to run a little long, but not the full length. I was worried I wouldn't have enough to talk about, but it looks like that's not an issue anymore. This is what happens when you anger the Dragon Lord. Fire, brimstone, it's terrible. Thanks everyone for joining, despite the crises, making it to this presentation, Dragon Warrior Reconsidered, 35 years on. As you can guess from the name and the date on there, I'm speaking specifically about the American version of Dragon Quest, the NES game released in August 1989, almost just a little more than 35 years ago, and kind of putting that in the context of the time and the place, and also its background in history, and asking the question, was this a good idea in the first place? I mean, I feel like you're here because you like Dragon Warrior or Dragon Quest in general, so I feel like you might be a little biased in favor of the series. But the actual release of Dragon Warrior for NES, it was a little bit fraught. And back in I guess last month at Long Island Retro Expo, I sat in with Lucas M. Thomas from Nintendo Force Magazine, and we interviewed Gail Tilden. And when the topic of Dragon Warrior came up, she was the editor of Nintendo Power and head of their marketing in the NES era. And when the topic of Dragon Warrior came up, you could just see waves of exasperation rising off of her. So, you know, for some people, it was a great experience. Playing at home, saving Princess Gwaelin, defeating the Dragon Lord. But, you know, on the business side of things, maybe not so good. So we are going to begin. Okay, you know how that goes. Anyway, yes, thanks for joining me. Here we go. So before we get started talking about whether or not Dragon Warrior was a good or bad idea, let's dive into the basics because there's nothing I love more than context. Dragon Warrior was released as Dragon Quest in May of 1986 in Japan on the Nintendo Family Computer, or Famicom. As you may have noticed, 1986 was not 1989, and therein our problems lie, I think. But that was where the series got its start. It was developed by a company called Chunsoft, which was really, at the time, like one guy, Koichi Nakamura. And it was published by Enix. And we'll talk about their relationship and the importance of Enix in all of this, because Enix had no real involvement in Dragon Warrior's release for NES. They published 2, 3, and 4 here, but everything else kind of happened without them. But without Enix, there would have been no Dragon Quest or Dragon Warrior. The rest of the team was the designer and writer, Yuji Horii, the programmer, I mentioned, Koichi Nakamura, the illustrator, of course, the late Akira Toriyama, and the composer was a guy named Koichi Sugiyama, who has also passed. Again, released in the US as Dragon Warrior, 3 years after its Japanese debut, and Europe was just SOL, no Dragon Warrior whatsoever. I guess maybe because they felt, oh, the Europeans will see this fake European dialogue and laugh it out of the continent. So they missed out. And it wasn't until, I want to say, Dragon Quest VIII that Europe actually got a Dragon Quest, Dragon Warrior game. Someone can shout and correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I believe Dragon Quest VIII was the first game to make it to Europe. So that's a long time to go without. I mean, we felt bad missing out on 5 and 6 here for a long time, but they got the really late start. They always got the, you know, kind of passed over for all the cool stuff, except Terranigma. So Dragon Warrior, or rather Dragon Quest, was released, you know, and created in Japan, but it was inspired by American PC role-playing games such as Ultima and Wizardry. Specifically, Yuji Horii was a huge fan of Wizardry. He famously went with a group of people to a Macworld convention in the early 80s and saw Wizardry running on old Apple computers. You know, that would have been Apple II at that point, so I guess it was before Macworld. And was just really impressed. And for a long time, there were a lot of American and I guess Canadian RPGs making their way over to Japan and being picked up by the Japanese audience there, the really hardcore gamers who would hang out in the electronics shop and be like, oh, what's this really cool computer from another country with video games in another language that I can't even really read and play? This is so awesome. Like, they were the hardest of the hardcore, and that's kind of where Dragon Quest came from. The series became one of Japan's most beloved and best-selling game properties. As we know, it's, well, actually, Dragon Quest VII, for example, was the best-selling PlayStation 1 game in Japan of all time. It outsold Gran Turismo, it outsold Final Fantasy VII and VIII, it outsold Resident Evil, all those games. It outsold Final Fantasy VII, the second best-selling game on the PlayStation in Japan, by more than 500,000 units, almost 600,000 copies more of Dragon Warrior 7 sold. And if you've seen what Dragon Warrior 7 looks like, and visually compare that to Final Fantasy VII, it seems baffling. It seems unbelievable that a game so pokey and primitive looking could have just humbled Final Fantasy VII, the game at the bleeding edge of technology. But that just speaks to the affection and the love that exists among the Japanese audience for Dragon Quest. It's a part of people's childhoods. It's their memories of growing up. They hold that in the same esteem that we hold Zelda over here, really. At this point, there have been 10 direct sequels to Dragon Quest, Dragon Warrior. The 12th game, Dragon Quest 12, is in the works, and there are, I didn't even bother to count how many dozens of spin-off games like Dragon Warrior Monsters, Dragon Quest Heroes, Dragon Quest Builders, etc., etc. It's just, there have been Mystery Dungeon games. It's just a whole thing, a whole franchise. And it was a huge bomb in America. Kind of. So let's go back to the start.
今、新しい伝説が生まれようとしている。NES.
So that was the original Japanese television commercial for Dragon Quest back in 1986. The premise of that was, here's the designer, here's the illustrator, here's the composer. Like, these are famous names. You love these guys. And the hero, the cast, is you. So it was, trying to bring the player, the audience, into the notion that they were sitting among these esteemed fellows and that they were, the hero of Dragon Quest. I feel like that's a pretty compelling sales pitch and a very kind of stylish and cool commercial for a video game in 1986, for sure. So anyway, that's the background. Now we're going to break down the facts and the fallacies about Dragon Quest. The true things and the false things, and the things that are sort of in between. So Dragon Quest, Dragon Warrior, was the first JRPG, Japanese RPG. True or false?
False.
False. Oh, someone said true. You're mistaken. It's actually false by a long shot. Now, it's hard to say, actually, everybody has their own idea of what RPG means. What is a role-playing game? If you call Zelda an RPG, or say it's built on RPG principles, some people get real head up. They do not like that. But other people are like, yeah, that's totally cool. So, there's the question, what is a role-playing game? But however you define role-playing game, Dragon Quest was not the first to be developed and created in Japan for a Japanese audience, etc., etc. Here are some possible first candidates for what might have been the original JRPG. First, there's Dragon and Princess, which is a game by Koei, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms people, and the Muso games where there's thousands and thousands of people fighting. But this was built very much in the style of like an Ultima or something. It's very, very simple, straightforward. But that's from 1982. So that predates Dragon Warrior, Dragon Quest by a few years. There's also this game, Panorama no To, by Falcom, which came out a year later. And it's kind of like a simulation / RPG. If you saw the footage there, let me back that up and show it again. If you look at the little window in the bottom, the guy in the main window went up to a tree and hit it and caused an apple to fall off. So that's not really combat, but there was this element of gathering and crafting. The more traditional take on the first, like the claim for the more traditional, this is the first Japanese RPG, was the Black Onyx by Bulletproof Software, which came out the month after Panorama no To, which was not actually created by a Japanese studio. It was created by Hank Rogers, the guy you might know from Tetris, and his company Bulletproof Software. But he had immigrated to Japan and saw that there was this kind of interest in role-playing games and a vacuum, really. And so he made a proper wizardry-style windowed RPG. This is the SG-1000 Sega version from 1987, but it's pretty similar to the computer version that came before it. It's, you move through this little windowed first-person perspective and fight guys. So these all came before Dragon Quest. So, point 2, Dragon Warrior, Dragon Quest, was the first console RPG. Is that true or false?
False.
Really? You say false. I say more or less true. It depends again on how you define what an RPG is. But looking back through my records, at least, okay, in Japan anyway, there were some games that were kind of nuzzling up to RPG status released on Atari 2600 and in television, but they didn't quite get there. They were kind of in that same vein as Dragon and Princess. Sort of actiony, sort of simple, like Dragon Slayer. But again, yeah, like I said, it depends on how you define RPG. But if you look at the RPGs that were coming out of Japan in the early 80s, to that point, they had been designed specifically for computers. All the games we saw before were for like the PC 8801 or the FM7 or the MSX, all these systems that never came to the West. Here's a couple of examples. On the left, we have Dragon Slayer, also by Falcom. And that's a very simple take on role-playing concepts. You know, walk in one direction, bump into something until one of you die. But you're also gathering stuff. On the right, you have Ultima 3, which was designed in the West, obviously, and imported into Japan. But that was designed for Apple II computers. Yeah, it's really loud. When you looked at games that were actually released on consoles in Japan before Dragon Quest, such as the Famicom, the SG-1000 actually didn't have any. Yeah, there weren't really that many role-playing games of any kind, of any variety, on Japanese consoles. They were generally action games wearing the aesthetics of role-playing games. On the left, you have Tower of Jiraga, which came out the year before Dragon Quest on Famicom. Actually started the year before that as an arcade game, so you know it wasn't a proper RPG. On the right, you've probably seen that one game. Again, like I said, people get really mad when you say that Zelda is an RPG, but there is some substance to that. At the same time, though, it is an action game, and it really takes away all the menu-driven elements that people think of when they think of RPGs, and really simplified things. There were no experience points, etc. So, everything was kind of designed with this action framework in mind. And then there were some people who had the audacity, some publishers in Japan on Famicom, who had the audacity to call their games RPGs, and they were nothing of the sort. And I'm looking specifically at Senko Zunan Galg for Famicom 1985. Does that look like an RPG to you?
Yes.
Let me guess, because you're playing the role of a spaceship, right? No, they call it a scroll RPG, and I think the justification for that is that in Zenon Sunko, I can't even remember the name of it, Galg. When you play Galg, you're collecting an item in each stage. You have to collect one item. And you have to collect 50 of these items in each stage, in all 50 stages, so that you can go to the final level. That's their idea of an RPG. No. But the fact that the box says right there in big bold letters in English, Scroll RPG, that does speak to this growing groundswell of enthusiasm for the role-playing game among Japanese gamers in the mid-'80s. Like, there were these games that were kind of importing over, and they were getting coverage in magazines, and you would see them on display in computer shops, and they were always on these expensive overseas computers or really pricey domestic computers, and they seemed intriguing. But if you were someone who had a tween's allowance, you were not buying a PC 9801 to play Dragon Slayer. You had a Famicom because it cost 1/10 as much as a computer. And so you were kind of left out, and people started to recognize, like, this is a trendy, hip, cool thing. Kids are interested in it. We should call our game an RPG, even if it absolutely is not. What's that?
Guardian Legend.
Guardian Legend is very much a RPG-inflected game, but it came after by about 2 years. So definitely did not beat Dragon Quest to the punch. No, Dragon Warrior, Dragon Quest, was designed from the ground up to play as a traditional RPG on consoles, and that made it a first. And its design was actually largely based on a game that Yuji Horii and Koichi Nakamura had worked on before for Enix, which was an adventure game called Portopia Renzoku Satsujin Jiken, which was the Portopia serial murder case. And this game itself was very popular, sold really well on computers, and then again sold like 500,000 copies on Famicom, and sparked this entire trend of murder mystery games. So things like Jake Hunter and Phoenix Wright, like they owe their existence to Portopia. But the thing about Portopia is that when it came out on computers, it was one of the first games to use a windowed interface with like multiple windows for content and just the different information that it was feeding you, but it still was keyboard driven. And when that was designed by Yuji Horii, and when he teamed up with Nakamura and Chunsoft to bring it to Famicom, Nakamura reprogrammed it so that you didn't have to use a keyboard. Like the whole game was just driven by the D-pad and 2 buttons. So it was greatly streamlined. And that was a huge influence on Dragon Quest's design.
May I have your attention? Building staff has investigated and cleared the fire alarm condition. El edificio ha investigado y aclarado la condición de alarma de incendios. Por favor, proceda con sus actividades normales y gracias por su cooperación.
Gracias.
Building staff has investigated and cleared the fire alarm condition. Please resume your business and thank you for your cooperation. Atención, por favor.
So this may be a while.
Aclarado la condición de alarma de incendios. Por favor, proceda con sus actividades normales y gracias por su cooperación. May I have your attention? Has investigated and cleared the...
Okay. All right. I'm happy to say the Dragon Lord has been defeated. Nothing is on fire. I was really confused because I did not remember putting that audio clip in the slide. It really threw me there. All right, so where was I? Yes, so as I was saying, Portopia's redesigned Famicom version became the basis of Dragon Warrior's interface design. There we go, that sounds more like it. So all those windows, that's basically just like flipping the Portopia interface in a mirror image. And that was a big deal for console games because suddenly you could play a complex, full-featured...
And thank you for your cooperation. Atención, por favor. El personal del edificio ha investigado y aclarado la condición de alarma de incendios. Por favor, proceda con sus actividades normales y gracias por su cooperación. May I have your attention? Building staff has investigated and cleared the fire alarm condition. Please resume your business and thank you for your cooperation. Atención, por favor. El personal del edificio ha investigado.
So
Fireworks factory.
I was actually delayed. My flight here was supposed to be yesterday, but I actually came here and landed like 2 hours ago. I had to get up early this morning because of a hurricane. So yesterday was water, today was fire. I'm excited to see what happens tomorrow. I think the next element is electricity. We'll see. All right, so here's another example of in-game dialogue. Talking to the king. Say to your game. There we go. All right, good job, King. Okay, so hustling through. Part 3, or question 3. Dragon Warrior was conceived as a dream team game. Is that true or false?
Incendios. Por favor. Y gracias por su cooperación. May I have your attention? Building staff has investigated and cleared the fire alarm condition. Please resume your business and thank you for your cooperation. Atención, por favor. El personal del edificio ha investigado y aclarado la comisión de alarma de incendios. Por favor, proceda con sus actividades normales y gracias por su cooperación.
All right, anyway, true, false. What do you think? You saw that commercial? They were celebrating the dream team, but that wasn't actually just marketing. That was how the game was conceived. So Yuji Horii and Koichi Nakamura belonged to Enix's talent stable, which means, okay, Enix wasn't a game-making company. They were a publisher, but they would have contests or find promising developers and bring those people in and have them make games. And Horii and Nakamura both had great successes with their first games for Enix. So Enix kind of kept them sort of on retainer and had them make projects for them. And so, they collaborated on Portopio.
And cleared the fire alarm condition. Please resume your business and thank you for your cooperation. Atención, por favor. El personal del edificio ha investigado y aclarado la comisión de alarma de incendios. Por favor, proceda con sus actividades normales y gracias por su cooperación. May I have your attention? Building staff has investigated and cleared the fire alarm condition. Please resume your business and thank you for your cooperation. Atención, por favor. El personal del edificio ha investigado y aclarado la comisión de alarma de incendios. Por favor, proceda con sus actividades normales y gracias por su cooperación. May I have your attention?
It's a little less amusing this time. Okay, so I've got to really hustle through here now. So, even though Enix worked with Horii and Nakamura, it wasn't their idea to make Dragon Quest happen. That actually, the initiative came from an editor at Weekly Shonen Jump magazine, Kazuhiko Torishima, who basically, long story short, he had initiated coverage of video games in the magazine, but his lunch, like their lunch, was being eaten by competitors like Weekly Famitsu and Korokoro magazine. And so he said, we need a gimmick. We need something that's going to be interesting. So his idea was, why don't we focus, one, on console games, because our core audience can't afford computer games. Let's focus on console games. But two, what if we had a feature about creating a video game and followed the steps of the process through the development of a video game? So Enix and Shueisha, the publisher for Weekly Jump, were very closely related. They shared a lot of marketing and cross publication and things like that. So they collaborated and said, let's put together a game. And as it happened, Yuji Horii had also contributed writing to Weekly Jump. And he loved RPGs. And Torishima loved RPGs. So it all kind of came together. He said, let's have Horii make an RPG. Let's have him write an RPG. So naturally, Horii reached out to Koichi Nakamura and continued to collaborate. At the same time, you had composer Koichi Sugiyama, who was a really acclaimed commercial and orchestral composer, and he liked video games. He played computer games and really enjoyed the stuff that Enix was putting out. So he wrote to them and said, I would love to work on one of your games. So when this project came up, they said, that famous guy, Sugiyama, let's get him on here. So that connection happened. And then Torishima, worked for Shonen Jump, the magazine that published Dr. Slump and Dragon Ball, the works of Akira Toriyama. And he said, well, we need to get, a famous artist in here as a hook. And the Dragon Ball series is just kind of getting started, finding its audience. Why don't we have Akira Toriyama contribute some illustrations and design? And it wasn't just packaging design. Like, he made a really cool package, a really great box, very memorable, but he actually designed all the monsters. So it became this kind of collaborative effort. And, the rest is history. Or is it? Dragon Warrior was an instant hit. True or false? Well, Dragon Quest, sorry, in Japan. Dragon Quest was an instant hit.
Yes.
Whoa!
I'm sorry to say it sold pretty well. It sold okay. But at that point, people would put out a good Famicom game and they expected to sell 1 million, 2 million copies pretty easily. Dragon Quest sold a few 100,000, which is nothing to sneeze at, but they thought it has more potential than this. And because of the Shonen Jump connection, they continued to push the game in the magazine and promote it and kind of connect it to Toriyama. And word of mouth spread, kind of like Pokemon happened 10 years later. It just sort of gradually built up and more people bought it. So by the time Dragon Warrior 2 or Dragon Quest 2 came out the following year, it sold much better than the original. And by the time Dragon Quest 3 came out, it became, the story that everyone knows. If you have the original, the first issue of Nintendo Power, they were writing about, wow, people in Japan love this Dragon Quest game. Can't wait till it comes here. Look forward to it. And come here it did. Point 5, question. Nintendo of America put its whole ass into the localization of Dragon Quest. True or false?
True.
Absolutely true. And this is the point of great contention for some people. In 1986, Dragon Quest was published by Enix as a third-party title for Famicom, a game that used lengthy passwords in order to save progress, a game with primitive graphics. Oh, let's look at this. Oh, this is what Dragon Quest looked like in Japan when it first launched. If you've played the American version, I think you can recognize the fact that this is kind of rough. Like, look at those sprites. They don't turn around. They look like, kind of children's drawings. It's sort of an elegant. It's hard to look at. In 1989, Dragon Warrior was published by Nintendo as a first-party title, which gave it great status, great promotion, publicity, distribution. It was probably the biggest Japanese to English script ever seen in a video game at that point. Maybe Phantasy Star has more words. I don't know. It's going to be a toss-up. But in any case, it was much more rewritten. It was rewritten into a sort of Shakespearean dialect. They came up with new names for characters. They changed some of the jokes, like, for instance, if you rescue the princess and instead of taking her back to her castle to bring her back to her dad, if you go to an inn, the innkeeper's like, hey, hope we had a good night. They had to kind of smooth that over for America. It was a little more obvious what they were getting at in Japan. But they just worked really hard to write a game that flowed naturally in English and seemed like, it could have been something you'd have read in English class in 8th grade. And then they reprogrammed the game for the MMC-1 memory management chip, which meant that not only could it have more animation and more content, it could also save games with a battery, so no more writing down passwords with the king. And they tapped their ringer, Satoru Iwata. You may have heard of him. He was kind of Nintendo's pinch hitter guy. Like when they had a project they needed programmed, and really taken to the next level, they would reach out to him. Balloon fight, pinball, golf. Iwata was the one who handled the localization programming for Dragon Warrior. And Yuji Horii attested to this when Iwata passed about a decade ago and said this isn't well known, but yeah, we really owe a lot to Iwata because he jumped in and he went hands-on with this game and helped localize it. Again, like he would do 10, 15 years later with Pokemon, Pokemon Gold and Silver. So, that's always a sign of, I think, quality and importance in a game. Like when Nintendo reached out to Iwata, you knew they meant business. So they totally changed the graphics, changed the fonts, everything. Just made the game a lot more playable, accessible, and so forth. So that's the true and false section. Now let's look at what happened when it came here. Dragon Warrior was packed with content. It was the biggest and most elaborate package a video game had ever seen in the NES era. It didn't have the cool window and gold cartridge of Zelda, but it had more stuff in it. It had a manual, an explorer handbook, it had a little reference card, it had a map poster, it had a second poster to show you the charts for items and enemies and so forth. It's crazy stuff. I have a copy and it's almost impossible to get all that stuff back in the box. It's wild. They did their best to sell the Dragon Warrior. There was a ton of marketing support. They gave it television commercials.
It is
Not as cool as the Japanese commercial, I'm afraid,
cunning, the concentration, the wisdom to puzzle your way to a world beyond imagination. We shall see, won't we? Dragon Warrior from Nintendo, coming soon.
All right. And this is where Gail Tilden got frustrated, I think, because Nintendo Power had so much coverage of Dragon Warrior. It was absolutely ridiculous. There were teasers all the way back from the first issue, really. But then there were guides, there were choose your own adventure flowcharts, there was an inserted strategy guide that takes you all the way through the end of the game. They left nothing to the imagination with this game. But they really wanted kids to buy it. They were determined to sell you this game. And this is Nintendo proclaiming, begging you to tell you how much you love Dragon Warrior. There you go. You finally woke up to it. No, they wanted to sell you this game, but they didn't. I don't know. Actually, who here owned Dragon Warrior back in 1989? Let's hear it. Don't raise your hands. Let's hear a shout. Yeah! All right. But despite all of this, it flopped hard on Nintendo. The question is, true or false?
False.
No, it's pretty true. So it did okay when it sold. I owned a copy, so it couldn't have been like a total failure. I didn't own that many games. But Howard Phillips said in a Reddit Ask Me Anything a few years back that Nintendo drastically overestimated the appeal that this game would have to the US and ordered way too many copies. And the person behind this over-ordering was the Nintendo of America's president, Minoru Arakawa. So at least no one's head rolled for it, maybe his, I don't know, but like no underlings got sacked for it. But he understood how popular the series was in Japan and said it could be this big here, so let's go big. But instead of saying, why don't we publish the more elaborate, nice-looking, complex Dragon Warrior 3 in America, why don't we go back to the first game? But the problem is, it was a tough sell in 1989. I mean, I am someone who likes to cover things from the beginning to do chronologies, but that is not the way to launch a product line. So Nintendo decided to make the best of a bad situation. They decided to use it as a marketing tool to sell their best marketing tool. Oop.
Get ready for the biggest offer.
They gave Dragon Warrior away for
Subscribe
free
now to
if you
Nintendo
subscribe
Power.
to
Get a
Nintendo
free
Power.
Dragon Warrior game pack. That's a $40 value plus 12 big issues of scorching power tips and wicked video
And they
maps
used some
for
really
15
elaborate
bucks.
CG.
That.
Plus an explorer's
for it.
handbook to help you master the dragons and knights.
Yes.
Supplies are limited. Call 1-800-341.
A generation celebrated. No, they basically had $25 million of unsold video game inventory, so they gave it all away for free if you bought a $15 magazine subscription. So the game was $50, the magazine was $15. Not really the best math, but it's the $35 loss as opposed to a $50 loss. I guess that's something. But they did sell 500,000 subscriptions to Nintendo Power, which meant that every month kids were getting direct marketing sent to their mailbox and told like, hey, buy this stuff. So, I guess that's a happy outcome. And it did well enough that Enix said, all right, there's a brand here. Let's publish 3, 4, and 5 here, or 2, 3, and 4 here ourselves. And so Dragon Warriors 1 through 4, the whole tetralogy for NES, exists in English. You can play them. You can go out and spend $1,000 if you want and buy them now. I don't recommend it. And Nintendo didn't give up on trying to make role-playing games a thing in America. They gave really deluxe treatment to quite a few games going forward. Final Fantasy the following year, and then Star Tropics, their own video game. They gave that the dip it in the water strategy guide. 1994, you had Star Tropics 2 and Illusion of Gaia, which came with a huge manual and a T-shirt. And then, of course, Earthbound, which came in a huge box with a full-size strategy guide and also fart stickers. I don't know. It was weird marketing, but they went all into it. So this brings us to the ending, which I really have to rush through because we've got like 3 minutes. So you have a choice when you meet the Dragon Lord. Do you join his side or do you fight him? If the bad ending, if you choose to join him, we can talk about why Dragon Warrior failed. It's because it was old as heck in 1989. 2 years later, this is the kind of RPGs we were looking at. Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy II, a much more impressive looking game, stylish, exciting, amazing music. Like, this is more of the standard people were looking for in a game like this. So Dragon Quest and its very dated style just did not sell. It was also comedically simple in terms of content. America is the country where role-playing games were invented. So we got this reverse import that basically like watered it down to a children's story, like one of those board books. It was not a great choice. Also, its monsters looked too goofy for Americans to take seriously. I mean, you thought that CG dragon in the commercial was bad, but the in-game monsters were actually much sillier. And most of all, dozens of games inspired by Dragon Quest and Dragon Warrior had already shown up on NES, and basically did the Dragon Quest thing better than Dragon Quest did. You had games like Xanadu, which came out the same month, Zelda 2, etc. All these RPG-influenced games that beat the RPG that started it all to the console. So it just felt dated because there were all these other games that did these things better and in a more exciting way. So that's a shame. But I will end by saying the good ending is that Dragon Warrior actually ruled. Its simple design made it a great starting point for newcomers. If you wanted to learn more about RPGs and how they worked, you can't get simpler than Dragon Warrior until Final Fantasy Mystic Quest came along. The goofy monsters, they looked cartoonish and silly, but they gave the game personality, and everyone loves the slime. Among other monsters, the Drakis and the skeletons, and they just all have this distinctive style, and that's carried on through the series. It also set a new standard for English localizations in video games. Up to this point, English localizations were pretty bad. And this one, you may not like the style, but at least they put some effort into it. And most of all, Nintendo treated this game as an event, as a big deal. And it helped sell the idea that role-playing games were something special. They were an event. They were premium content. And it really helped establish a console role-playing fan base here in the States. Kind of like the original Dragon Quest, it took a while to catch on. Much too late to help Dragon Warrior, but it did kind of build this underground fan base of console RPG fans in the US, and that all started here. So anyway, that's it for Dragon Warrior. Let's see how it goes. Things are looking kind of rough for Dragon Warrior. No more magic points. It's going downhill. There we go. Okay, Dragon Warrior wins. All right. Thanks, everyone. If you want to hear more about Dragon Warrior, you can check out my NES Works video. And also, you can check out the books that I'm pre-selling now at limitedrungames.com, going from the beginning of the Famicom era, actually before that, all the way through the peak of the NES 8-bit era in America, which brings us to Dragon Warrior. All right, got to clear out for the next folks. So thank you for coming. Thank you for bearing with me through the emergencies and the fire alarms.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and here are a few more videos for you to check out.